What happened in Millfield, Ohio during the winter of 1867 challenges everything medical science thought it knew about human physiology and the boundaries between life and death. The official records were sealed for over 50 years, but recently discovered documents reveal a case so disturbing that 3 respected physicians chose to abandon their sacred oath rather than examine a single patient. This channel is only for those brave enough to confront the darkest mysteries that authorities desperately want to keep buried. In the small farming community of Millfield, Ohio, winter had always been brutal, but 1867 brought something far worse than cold and snow. It brought something that shouldn't have existed at all. On the morning of December 15th, as a devastating blizzard finally began to subside, Thomas Brennan, the local blacksmith, made a discovery that would haunt him for the remaining 37 years of his life. Walking through the knee-deep snow to check on his livestock, Brennan spotted a small figure moving slowly down the main street. At first glance, it appeared to be a child, perhaps 12 years old, wearing only a thin cotton shirt and torn trousers. What made Brennan's blood freeze wasn't the sight of a half-dressed child in sub-zero temperatures, but what he noticed as he got closer. The boy was walking barefoot through the snow, leaving absolutely no footprint behind him. Brennan later testified in a sworn statement, discovered in the basement of the Millfield Courthouse in 1923, that approaching the child felt like walking towards something that was pretending to be human, but had forgotten some crucial details about what that meant. The boy's skin was translucent, almost glass-like, revealing a network of dark veins that pulsed in rhythm that didn't match any heartbeat Brennan had ever witnessed. Most disturbing of all were the child's eyes, not their color, which seemed to shift between black and an unsettling pale blue, but the way they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When Brennan finally worked up the courage to approach, he called out a greeting. The boy turned his head with mechanical precision, like a door opening on well-oiled hinges, and fixed those impossible eyes on the blacksmith. No words were exchanged, but Brennan later swore that he heard voices, multiple voices, speaking in languages he didn't recognize, coming from somewhere inside the child but not from his mouth, which remained perfectly still. Fighting every instinct screaming at him to run, Brennan offered the boy shelter in his workshop. The child followed without protest, moving with an unnatural gliding motion that barely disturbed the air around him. Inside the warm smithy, Brennan expected the boy to show signs of relief or warmth, but his expression remained eerily blank. More unsettling still, despite being surrounded by the heat from the forge, the temperature in the workshop began dropping noticeably within minutes of the boy's arrival. Unable to get any response from the child, and growing increasingly uncomfortable with the unnatural cold that seemed to emanate from his small guest, Brennan decided to fetch the town's physician. Dr. Samuel Morrison had served Millfield for over 20 years and was known throughout the county for his steady nerves and scientific approach to medicine. If anyone could make sense of this strange situation, it would be Morrison. What Brennan couldn't have known was that Dr. Morrison would become the first of 3 respected physicians to encounter something so fundamentally wrong with this child that they would choose to abandon their medical practice rather than attempt an examination. Dr. Samuel Morrison arrived at Brennan's smithy within an hour, carrying his worn leather medical bag and expecting to treat a case of severe frostbite and exposure. A devoutly religious man who had served as a Union Army surgeon during the recent Civil War, Morrison had seen terrible injuries and inexplicable suffering, but nothing had prepared him for what awaited in that workshop. The moment Morrison entered the building, he later wrote in a private journal discovered after his death, "He felt as though I had stepped not into a room, but into a tomb that something was trying to claw its way out of." The temperature inside was now so cold that his breath formed visible clouds. Despite the roaring forge that should have made the space unbearably warm, Morrison approached the boy, who sat motionless on a wooden stool, staring ahead with those light-absorbing eyes. The physician began his standard examination routine, starting with visual observation. What he saw defied every principle of medicine he had studied. The boy's chest rose and fell, but the rhythm was all wrong, too slow, too deep, and occasionally stopping for periods that would have left any living person unconscious from oxygen deprivation. When Morrison reached for his stethoscope to listen to the boy's heartbeat, something extraordinary happened. The metal instrument began to tarnish and darken the moment it came within inches of the child's skin. Morrison tried again with a different tool, a simple wooden tongue depressor, and watched in horrified fascination as it would turn black and began to crumble upon contact with the boy's mouth. But it was when Morrison attempted to take the boy's pulse that he experienced something that would shatter his faith in rational medicine forever. The moment his fingers touched the child's wrist, he heard them, voices, dozens of them, whispering in languages both ancient and unknown. They weren't coming from the boy, whose mouth remained closed, but from inside Morrison's own mind, as if touching the child had opened some kind of direct channel to something that should not exist. The voices spoke of hunger, of cold that went deeper than physical temperature, of a place where light went to die. They whispered about being forgotten, about walking between worlds, about finding warm places to rest. Most terrifying of all, they seemed to recognize Morrison, calling him by name and describing his own memories with intimate detail. Memories he had never shared with anyone. Morrison released the boy's wrist and staggered backward, his hands shaking uncontrollably. In his private journal, he wrote that the child's skin had felt like touching the surface of a frozen pond, but underneath, something was moving, something vast and patient and hungry. The physician grabbed his medical bag and fled the workshop without a word of explanation to the bewildered blacksmith. That night, Morrison packed his belongings and left Millfield forever. He never practiced medicine again, eventually becoming a clerk in a small town in Pennsylvania where no one knew of his former profession. In his final journal entry about the incident, written 20 years later, he concluded, "Some ailments are beyond the reach of medicine. Some patients should never be examined. There are boundaries between life and death that should not be crossed, and that child had not just crossed them. He was living proof that they never truly existed at all." But Morrison's refusal to treat the strange boy was only the beginning. Word of the mysterious child had spread throughout the county, reaching 2 other physicians who would soon discover that some medical cases are better left undiagnosed. What do you think was really happening with this boy? Share your theories in the comments, because what happened next challenges everything we think we know about the nature of life itself. Dr. Heinrich Weiss received the urgent message on December 17th, 2 days after Morrison's hasty departure from Millfield. Weiss, a German immigrant with extensive training in European medical practices, prided himself on his scientific skepticism and rational approach to diagnosis. He had built a successful practice in the nearby town of Athens by treating cases that other physicians deemed hopeless or impossible. When Thomas Brennan's desperate letter reached him, describing a child who seemed immune to cold and whose presence caused inexplicable phenomena, Weiss saw an opportunity to apply his advanced medical knowledge to what was obviously a case of hysteria and superstition run wild. He packed his most sophisticated diagnostic equipment and made a journey to Millfield, confident that he would quickly solve what Morrison's primitive American training had failed to address. Weiss arrived to find the boy exactly as Brennan had described, sitting motionless in the corner of the smithy, staring ahead with those unsettling eyes that seemed to pull light into their depths. The German physician noted with professional interest that despite the sub-zero temperatures outside, the child showed no signs of hypothermia, frostbite, or even basic discomfort. His scientific mind immediately began formulating theories about rare genetic conditions or unusual metabolic disorders. Setting up his equipment with methodical precision, Weiss began the most thorough examination of his career. He started with temperature readings, using a precision thermometer imported from Berlin. The instrument registered the boy's body temperature at 62 degrees Fahrenheit, a reading that should have indicated death hours earlier. Assuming the thermometer was faulty, Weiss tried a second instrument, then a third. All gave the same impossible reading. More disturbing than the temperature anomaly was what happened to thermometers themselves. Within minutes of contact with the boy's skin, each instrument developed hairline cracks that spread rapidly across the glass. By the end of the examination, Weiss had lost 3 expensive thermometers to this inexplicable phenomenon. The physician's scientific skepticism began to waver when he attempted to examine the boy's eyes with an ophthalmoscope. Looking through the instrument into those pale irises was like peering into a deep well at midnight. But instead of seeing the normal reflection of blood vessels in the optic nerve, Weiss saw something that made him question his own sanity. Moving shadows, too organized to be random, too purposeful to be natural. They seemed to be aware of his observation, shifting and arranging themselves in patterns that suggested intelligence, alien intelligence. Weiss documented everything meticulously in his examination notes, which were later found hidden in a sealed compartment of his desk after his death. According to these records, the most disturbing part of the examination occurred when he attempted to draw a blood sample. The needle penetrated the boy's skin easily enough, but instead of the expected red blood, the syringe filled with a dark, viscous fluid that seemed to move independently within the glass chamber. Under microscopic examination, this substance revealed properties that defy classification. It contained no recognizable blood cells, no platelets, no plasma. Instead, Weiss observed what he described as geometric structures that rearranged themselves while being watched, as if they were trying to communicate through pattern and movement. Most unnervingly, the fluid maintained the same impossible 62-degree temperature as the boy's body, never warming to room temperature despite being separated from its source. But the true horror began when Weiss made direct physical contact with the boy during his examination. Like Morrison before him, the German physician experienced an immediate invasion of his consciousness by foreign voices. However, Weiss's more analytical mind allowed him to document the experience with terrifying precision. The voices, he wrote, spoke in mathematical concepts rather than words, communicating ideas about spatial relationships that human minds weren't designed to comprehend. They described locations that existed between dimensions, temperatures that went beyond absolute zero into realms where energy itself became confused and lost. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to be teaching him, sharing knowledge about medical procedures that could be performed on living subjects without their consent or awareness. Weiss realized with growing horror that these weren't random supernatural manifestations. They would preserve consciousness of medical practitioners from some other place, some other time, possibly some other reality entirely. They had been trapped within this child's body, and they were desperate to continue their work through any physician brave or foolish enough to make contact. The examination ended abruptly when Weiss attempted to listen to the boy's heartbeat with his stethoscope. The moment the chest piece made contact with the child's skin, the metal instrument became so cold that it stuck to Weiss's ears, causing severe frostbite that would leave permanent scars. But far worse than the physical injury was what he heard through the stethoscope in that moment of contact. Instead of a heartbeat, Weiss heard the sound of dozens of hearts beating in unison, but not in the rhythm of life. These were the irregular, desperate rhythms of hearts that were dying, over and over again, in an endless cycle of resurrection and decay. Each beat was accompanied by whispered pleas in languages both ancient and unborn, begging for release from their eternal examination. Weiss tore the stethoscope from his ears, leaving strips of frozen skin behind, and fled from the smithy without collecting his equipment. Like Morrison before him, he abandoned his medical practice immediately. But unlike his predecessor, Weiss's response was more dramatic. He spent his remaining years in a private asylum, convinced that the voices were still with him, still trying to teach him procedures that no human should ever learn. His final words, recorded by an attendant at the asylum, were a warning. The boy is not a patient. He is a doorway, and something on the other side is using him to study us. Thank you for staying with us through this disturbing account. The most shocking revelations are still to come. The third and final physician to encounter the mysterious boy was Dr. Jonathan Crawford, a man whose reputation for solving impossible medical cases had earned him recognition throughout the Ohio Territory. Crawford had studied at Harvard Medical School and had published papers on rare diseases that had gained him international attention. If any physician could provide a rational explanation for the boy's condition, it would be Crawford. Unlike his predecessors, Crawford approached the case with a team of assistants and a wagon full of the most advanced medical equipment available in 1867. He had read Morrison's hastily written letter describing the incident and had dismissed it as the product of an overwrought imagination. Weiss's more detailed account, sent from the asylum, Crawford attributed to a complete mental breakdown triggered by some unknown psychological trauma. Crawford was determined to prove that medical science could explain any phenomenon, no matter how bizarre it might appear to untrained observers. He arrived in Millfield on December 22nd, exactly 1 week after the boy's first appearance, with a confidence that would be completely shattered within hours of beginning his examination. The boy's condition had deteriorated noticeably in the days since Weiss's examination. His already translucent skin had become even more glass-like, revealing not just a dark network of veins, but also what appear to be additional structures moving beneath the surface. Structures that didn't correspond to any known human anatomy. The child's eyes had grown darker and more light-absorbing, creating the unsettling illusion that looking at him was like staring into holes cut in reality itself. Crawford began his examination with confidence, dismissing the unnaturally cold temperature in the smithy as a simple matter of poor insulation and the psychological effects of suggestion. He instructed his assistants to document everything while he performed what he planned to be the most comprehensive medical examination ever conducted on such an unusual case. The first sign that this would not be a routine diagnosis came when Crawford attempted to use a newly invented device called a sphygmomanometer to measure the boy's blood pressure. The inflatable cuff, made of rubber and canvas, began to crack and split the moment it came into contact with the child's arm. More disturbing still, the metal component of the device, the gauge, the valve, the connecting tubes, began to corrode rapidly, as if exposed to some form of acid that couldn't be seen or smelled. Crawford's assistants documented each impossible occurrence with growing unease. Thermometers shattered, stethoscopes turned black and brittle, and metal instruments developed a patina of frost that couldn't be melted even when held directly over an open flame. But Crawford, driven by scientific curiosity and professional pride, pressed on with the examination. The breakthrough, if it could be called that, came when Crawford decided to perform what was then an experimental procedure, attempting to photograph the boy's internal structure using a primitive X-ray device he had acquired from a colleague in Germany. The process required the boy to remain perfectly still for several minutes while a photographic plate was exposed to radiation passed through his body. What the developed photograph revealed defied every principle of human anatomy Crawford had ever studied. Instead of the expected skeletal structure, the image showed a void, a perfect, human-shaped emptiness surrounded by what appeared to be geometric patterns that shouldn't have been possible to capture on photographic film. But most disturbing of all, the patterns in the photograph seemed to move when viewed directly, rearranging themselves into new configurations that suggested intelligence and purpose. Crawford's assistants fled when the developed photograph began emitting the same unnatural cold that surrounded the boy. They later testified, in statements sealed by court order, that the image seemed to be trying to communicate with them, that the moving patterns were attempting to spell out words in languages that predated human civilization. Left alone with the boy and his impossible photograph, Crawford made a decision that would prove to be his last as a practicing physician. He reached out and touched the child's forehead, hoping to detect signs of fever or other conventional symptoms that might explain the extraordinary phenomena. The contact lasted only seconds, but in that brief moment, Crawford experienced what he later described as being pulled into a place where medicine becomes torture, where healing becomes dissection, where patients become specimens in experiments that last for eternity. He saw operating theaters that existed in spaces between dimensions, staffed by surgeons whose hands had been replaced with instruments of precision beyond human understanding. Most horrifying of all, Crawford realized that he was not seeing these visions as an observer. He was experiencing them as a patient, strapped to an examination table that existed simultaneously in thousands of different realities, being studied by intelligences that viewed human consciousness as nothing more than an interesting biological function to be cataloged and preserved. When Crawford finally broke the connection and staggered away from the boy, his hair had turned completely white, and his hands shook so violently that he would never again be able to perform surgery. But the physical changes were nothing compared to what he had learned about the boy's true nature. In his final report, hidden in a safety deposit box and discovered only after his death in 1891, Crawford wrote, "The child is not suffering from any medical condition known to science. He is not, in fact, suffering at all. He is serving as a conduit for intelligences that exist in a place where the concept of medicine has evolved beyond our understanding, into something that would be better described as systematic torture performed for the sake of knowledge itself. They are studying us one subject at a time, and this boy is their window into our world." Crawford concluded his report with a warning that would prove prophetic. The boy will disappear soon, but he will return. When winter comes again, when the boundary between worlds grows thin, he will come back, and each time he returns, he will bring with him more knowledge, more hunger, and more sophisticated methods of examination. We are not his doctors, we are his specimens. If you're still watching this, Prepare yourself. The final truth about what happened to Boy will change everything you think you know about the boundaries between life and death. The boy vanished on December 23, 1867, exactly 8 days after his first appearance in Millfield. Thomas Brennan discovered his absence when he arrived at the smithy that morning to find only an empty stool and a perfect circle of melted snow where the child had been sitting. But the boy's disappearance was far from the end of the story. It was merely the beginning of a cover-up that would involve federal authorities and cost the lives of everyone who had direct contact with the mysterious child. Within hours of the boy's disappearance, men in dark suits arrived in Millfield claiming to represent the United States Department of Health. This was suspicious for several reasons, not least of which was the fact that no such department existed in 1867. These officials, who refused to provide their names or credentials, immediately began confiscating all medical records, photographs, and personal accounts related to the boy's case. Thomas Brennan was the first to resist their demands. The blacksmith had hidden copies of his sworn statement about finding the boy, along with detailed sketches he had made of the child's unusual physical characteristics. When he refused to surrender these documents, Brennan was found dead in his workshop 3 days later. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but witnesses reported that his body had been discovered in the exact position the boy had occupied during his week-long stay, sitting perfectly upright on the wooden stool, staring ahead with empty eyes. More disturbing still was the condition of Brennan's remains. Despite dying in December, his body showed no signs of decay. Instead, his skin had taken on the same translucent quality that had characterized the mysterious boy. Local undertakers refused to handle the burial, claiming that touching Brennan's body caused severe frostbite. He was eventually interred in an unmarked grave by the federal officials, who performed the burial at night without witnesses. The 3 physicians who had examined the boy met similarly mysterious ends over the following 6 months. Dr. Morrison, despite having fled to Pennsylvania, was found dead in his boarding house room in March of 1868. His landlady reported that the room had been so cold that ice had formed on the walls, despite a blazing fireplace. Morrison's body was discovered sitting at his desk, apparently writing his journal, but the pages contained only repetitive phrases in languages no scholar could identify. Dr. Weiss died in the asylum where he had been committed after his encounter with the boy. Attendants found him in his cell one morning, sitting motionless and staring ahead with an expression they described as peaceful but wrong. The most unsettling detail of Weiss's death was that other patients in the asylum reported hearing multiple voices coming from his cell throughout the night, carrying on conversations in medical terminology that seemed to involve procedures being performed on subjects who begged for death. Dr. Crawford's death was perhaps the most significant, as it provided the clearest evidence that the boy's case was being systematically covered up by powerful interests. Crawford had been living in seclusion since his encounter with the child, spending his time writing detailed reports about what he had experienced and observed. On the night of June 15, 1868, his house was destroyed in a fire that burned so intensely it melted the iron fixtures. Crawford's body was never found, but neighbors reported seeing him standing in the flames, completely motionless, as if he were participating willingly in his own destruction. All official records of the boy's appearance in Millfield were systematically removed from local archives. Birth records, death certificates, medical reports, even newspaper accounts. Everything disappeared as if the incident had never occurred. The federal officials who had supervised this cover-up vanished as completely as the documents they had confiscated, leaving behind no trace of their identities or the authority under which they had operated. But the most chilling evidence of an ongoing cover-up emerged decades later. In 1923, during renovation of the Millfield Courthouse, workers discovered a sealed room in the basement that contained hundreds of similar case files from across the Midwest. Each file documented encounters with children who matched the exact description of the boy from 1867. Translucent skin, light-absorbing eyes, impossible body temperature, and the ability to drive medical professionals to madness or death. The dates on these files revealed a disturbing pattern. Similar incidents had occurred every 17 years, always during harsh winters, always in small, isolated communities. The locations formed a rough geographic circle centered on the Ohio Territory, suggesting that the phenomenon was slowly expanding its area of influence. Most terrifying of all, The files indicated that the incidents were becoming more frequent, and the children were staying longer in each location. Recent research conducted by independent investigators has uncovered additional evidence that the cover-up continues to this day. Hospitals throughout the Midwest maintain informal protocols for handling temperature anomaly patients, children who present with impossible vital signs and cause medical equipment to malfunction. These cases are immediately referred to federal health agencies that officially don't exist, and all records are classified under national security provisions. Local folklore in Millfield and surrounding communities speaks of a winter child who appears during the worst blizzards, always looking for warm places to rest and doctors willing to examine him. Old-timers warn that anyone who sees this child should avoid direct contact and never, under any circumstances, attempt to provide medical care. The most recent confirmed sighting occurred in 2015, when a child matching the historical description was found by state highway workers during a severe winter storm near the original location in Ohio. The workers reported the incident to local authorities, but by the time emergency responders arrived, both the child and the workers had vanished. Their abandoned vehicles were found days later, encased in ice despite the engine still running and the heaters functioning normally. Modern medical professionals who have researched this case off the record suggest that the boy represents something far more terrifying than a supernatural anomaly. They believe he may be evidence of medical experimentation conducted by intelligences that exist outside our normal understanding of reality, beings that view human consciousness as nothing more than data to be collected and preserved. If this theory is correct, then the boy is not a victim of these experiments, but rather their most successful result, a perfect hybrid of human form and alien intelligence, designed to study our species from the inside. Each appearance allows these beings to gather more information about human physiology and psychology, refining their understanding of what makes us human, and how that humanity might be systematically removed or preserved. The 17-year cycle suggests that the boy returns when his handlers have processed the data from his previous visit and are ready to conduct new experiments. Each time, he stays longer and affects more people, indicating that the scope of the research is expanding. The deaths of medical professionals who examine him may not be accidental side effects, but rather necessary components of the experimentation process. Ways of testing how human minds react to knowledge that shouldn't exist. What makes this case particularly disturbing is the possibility that the boy's appearances are not random supernatural events, but rather carefully planned scientific missions. If true, then we are not dealing with a ghost story or urban legend, but with evidence of ongoing alien research into human nature, conducted one examination at a time, one winter child at a time. The next 17-year cycle is approaching. Based on the historical pattern, the boy should return to Ohio within the next few winters. When he does, he will likely be more sophisticated than ever before, carrying with him decades of accumulated knowledge about human psychology and the methods needed to extract information from unwilling subjects. Perhaps the most chilling question is not whether the boy will return, but what he and his handlers have learned from nearly 2 centuries of studying us. And more importantly, what they plan to do with that knowledge when their research is finally complete. And don't miss our next video. Subscribe to the channel and enter the placelet and follow other stories so intriguing and frightening like this. Click on the screen to watch it now.